Good evening. When the sign-up sheet came out, I zeroed in on chapter 9 just because you know the kinds of things I like to preach on. Chapter 9 brings in Israel, and you start looking at the whole great plan of salvation, and I like to tie the Old Testament and the New Testament together, and that's what we have here. The section, Romans 9 through 11, has been called different things. A parenthesis, a digression, even an interruption. Even Mr. Schofield's notes right here, it says parenthetic. And of course, I love Mr. Schofield. I like his Bible. But I was never happy with that explanation. Not in Romans. I mean, what an important book this is. Just to get its place in the book, Romans opens with the subject of justification, saved from God's wrath and so on, chapters 1 through 4. And then it really shifts to more sanctification and fixing the wreckage in mankind due to Adam's sin and that like. And that's always the order, of course, right? Justification, then sanctification, or in the tabernacle, the altar, and then the laver. You get the idea. And now he goes into Israel. And Paul asks questions. I've heard some of the sessions. Paul asks questions. It's a great rhetorical device. After talking about the grace of God and all in chapter 5, then chapter 6 opens, well, what then? Shall we sin that grace may increase? And God forbid. So I do it too when I'm preaching. Sometimes I ask a question and not expecting an answer. I give the answer just as Paul does many times. Okay, wonderful. So that kind of sets it up. The third section, beginning with our chapter 9 and concerning Israel. Not a parenthesis or a digression. Paul, at the height of his powers, under the influence, under the control, the direction of the Holy Spirit, with limited time and space, in the midst of writing the foundational book on the gospel, did he wander off and go into a subject unrelated to the previous 8 chapters? Like he lost his place? Like it, again, it never made sense to me. How exactly it's connected, I didn't really fully understand. I think I have a better handle now, I hope so. He opens chapter 9 and he talks about Israel's failure in faith and in service. So why bring that up now? What does it have to do with the gospel? And I would say much in every way. Our faith, our gospel is built on a historical process. It's built upon the Old Testament prophets. I was I was at a pet sit, as you know, I pet sit, and I was in Hawaii, and the hostess there took occasion to lambaste the Bible and the gospel, because I guess she knew where I stood. And she said this, that, they just wanted to start a new religion, and so they borrowed all these verses from the Old Testament to give it some credibility. And that's okay, we could laugh about it. It was a little tough conversation, frankly. But no, all these Old Testament references are there because the gospel, God's great plan of salvation, didn't just start 2,000 years ago. It started well before that. And a lot of it concerned the Jewish nation and the prophets. And then, of course, it comes into the New Testament and to us. So you might ask, why did God bring Israel up at all, back in the day? It was a rebuke to the idolatry of the pagan world and an example for them. Israel had what was called the imageless temple. Bizarre in the pagan world. How do you have a temple and you don't have an image of your God? Who do you even know you're worshiping? They didn't have a statue or an icon of some kind. Well, Israel had great privileges, but failed. They would lapse back into idolatry again and again and have to be called back or dragged back by the prophets. And finally, God sent them to Babylon. And it did largely cure them of idolatry, even to this day. You know, you go into any synagogue in the world, I think I could say that without contradiction, and you will not find an image. Babylon was serious medicine, but it cured them and will until the very end times, of course. They were to produce the Messiah, and they did, and they rejected him. That's a failure. How can the Gentiles believe in this gospel plan if even the important nation of Israel rejected him? And Paul imagines, you know, when he asks these questions, he knows what his readers are thinking, because he's making a point. I know what you're thinking. You're asking this question. He asks the question and answers it. And he does it again here. If Israel is so central to God's plan of redemption through the ages, and Israel has failed, then what has become of God's plan? Surely the wheels have come off, and God's great plan of redemption is now in ruins. This is the objection that Paul is anticipating. This is what he addresses in chapters 9 through 11. So, in fact, here's a way to think about this redemption and the historical process. Is anyone here redeemed? Yes, okay. By the blood of the Lamb? Amen. Where did you get this blood of the Lamb metaphor from? Did you make that up? No, come from the Bible. Oh, the Exodus story. Yeah. I see. And was that just like an empty metaphor? You say, oh no, that's in the Bible. It's inspired of God. Oh, so all that about Moses and the Exodus and the Passover and Abraham and all much more, that's part of God's great plan of redemption. Yes, it's a historical process. And Israel has gone wrong. And so we have chapter 9, 10, and 11 in Romans. This is not a digression or a parenthesis. It is a crucial question that must be answered. Paul begins, I'll get into the chapter now, verse 3, by describing his grief for the nation as a whole. And then he describes Israel's role in God's plan. He speaks of the adoption as sons, which is interesting language. We think usually first thought we would have is it applies to the church, and it does. It applies to Israel too. Maybe a little different way, but certainly speaks of relationship. And then you see the glory. The Shekinah glory of God descended on the tabernacle and later on the temple. And God manifested himself, presented himself before the nation of Israel. Wonderful. It's amazing that he chose Israel. Of course, we know why, not because they were great. They weren't the very sophisticated culture of the day. They weren't Egyptians or Babylonians. But they had the glory of God, and others didn't. The covenants, and we read that, and the giving of the law, a moral covenant. You know, in the ancient world, if you wanted to know about morals or something, you would not go to your temple. As the last place you'd go. They had nothing to say about morals. They had temple prostitutes, for crying out loud. They were offering child sacrifices in some places. You go to the priest in those temples and you ask them about morals, they'll say, oh, I don't know, I'm gonna go talk to the philosophers. Maybe they have an idea. Not with God. God presented himself as a moral God and who cared about the morality of his people. Very different. And then you read of the promises, who are the fathers. They prophesied of the coming of the Messiah. Verse 5, Christ blessed forever. So we have this historical process. as far as Israel is concerned, reaching its pinnacle in the birth of the Messiah. And that leads us into our gospel. So, as I said, the subject here is Paul's defense of the faith, defense of the gospel in light of the Jews' failure. But I have to point out, they also had a lot of success. They did receive the adoption. They did have the glory. They had the covenants, the law in particular. They did the service of God, that is the religious rituals which God had prescribed for the tabernacle and temple. And they prophesied of Christ and brought him into the world. They had successes, they did. Ultimately, they failed though. And why? That's in our chapter, verse 31. But Israel, which followed after the law of righteousness, hath not attained the law of righteousness. Wherefore, or why? Another question, which he answers, because they sought it not by faith, but as it were by the works of the law. The Lord ran into this, you see in the Gospels. He preached some great words, and Pharisees were with it. Hey, young man, you're doing great. And then he started talking about saving them from their sin. And boy, did that conversation change. Who do you think you're talking to about sin? You take that stuff across the street, young man. No, they didn't think they needed to be saved. They were trying to fulfill the law. So Paul is like almost in tears as he opens this chapter. It all seems to have gone wrong, but has it? And Paul says, no, not so. Verse 6, not as though the word of God hath taken none effect. Yes, Israel was in a sorry state, and they had rejected their Messiah. But his word, really, I think here, meaning his plan, the great gospel plan, and his purposes in redemption, has not failed. And then the reason you see in the rest of that verse that all Israel is not Israel. Paul makes a distinction between those who are Abraham's seed, all naturally born Jews, and the spiritual seed. He mentions this again. You look at verse 27 of our chapter about Isaiah, also crieth concerning Israel. And he mentions a remnant that shall be saved at the end of verse 27. And verse 29, except the Lord of Sabaoth had left us a seed or a remnant, we would have been like Sodom and been made like Gomorrah. You saw this also in the Gospels. When they were arguing with the Lord, I think the same passage I was just referring to, they said, we're Abraham's seed. And the Lord is like, that's funny. I don't think Abraham would have acted the way you're acting. There'd be a resemblance. See, they were natural descendants, but not the spiritual descendants. That's what Paul's getting at the second part of verse 6. And then they said, well, we have God as our father. And the Lord's like, that's funny too, like if God were your father, you'd love me like he loves me. They weren't spiritual descendants, just genetic descendants, if you will. And when God rises up to judge, not the Gentiles only, but Israel too, a remnant shall be left. There was a remnant, there's always been a remnant. He talks about that. I am skipping the intermediate verses in this chapter because I think that's not the main force of the argument I'm trying to stress. There's always a remnant. Paul was part of the remnant. The apostles, Mary, Martha, Lazarus, Simeon in the temple, Anna, John the Baptist. That's spiritual Israel. There's always going to be this remnant. Paul continues this argument when he starts chapter 11. I'm not going to get into it, but he opens up verse 1 and says, yeah, it is a remnant. In fact, I'm part of it. I'm an Israelite and God hasn't cast me away. You know, the continued existence of the remnant, spiritual Israel, is God's pledge that the whole nation will be restored. So this is going to be a glorious success and not a failure. Has God's plan gone wrong? He's anticipating his readers asking this question, and he says, absolutely not. Or as Paul would say, God forbid. There is a remnant according to grace, which is composed of Jews who have consented to be saved by grace, not like most, as we read in verse 32, who rejected this. The natural seed of Abraham has rejected this. The spiritual seed of Abraham is with us today. I'm just reminded of a story. Where is the spiritual seed of Israel today? I remember calling one of the older guys at Bethany. I'm trying to remember his name today. And I know he knows the Bible. So I was reading this remnant. It's in chapter 11, actually, where it says there's a remnant to this day. And I called him. I said, I was just reading this. And where is this remnant? I mean, it has to be in the church, right? And what was funny, he said, I just read that today. I went right over it, didn't even think about it. But he said, yeah, of course, it has to be in the church. And I've met some of these people when I was at Bethany. I can think of Fran Pavisi, Fred Barnow, who were Jews in the church. Spiritual Israel, the remnant, alive and well. So God had called Israel to be his witnesses, and that's exactly what they will be. Think of the New Testament epistles for a moment. How many of them were written by Jews? There you go. Half of them by Paul himself. When you get to the end of this long argument, I mean, it opens here in chapter 9, and I'm not going to talk about chapters 10 and 11, but the end of chapter 11, when Paul is wrapping up his argument, he speaks about the wisdom of God. When he finished the second section, as I call it, chapter 8, he goes into this long paean of praise. We don't use that word too often. Paean of praise to the love of God. He's talking about salvation and our great gospel story. And who will separate us from the love of God? It really reaches a crescendo. When he gets to the end of chapter 11 and the section on Israel, he reaches another crescendo, but it's not about love. It's about the wisdom of God. And not just wisdom in general, like isn't God smart? He talks about the wisdom in how he chose and used Israel, that he concluded them in unbelief, that the Gentiles might come in. In fact, he concluded all in unbelief, it says, so that he might save some, have mercy. I'm saying the phrase he uses, mercy. So Paul's anticipating this problem, this concern of his readers. They're going to say, well, what about Israel? Paul defends it, he explains the whole thing, and when he wraps it up, he says, not only is this not a problem, this is the great proof of the wisdom of God. His ways are past our understanding, but look what he did. Yes, Israel failed. He used their failure and brought the Gentiles in. And now he's also using the Gentiles, by the way, to make them jealous and bring them in. He concludes all in unbelief. He proves people are unbelievers in order to get them to believe. Wow. No human being would have thought that plan up. But that's Paul's argument. A wonderful argument. The capstone of his argument in the book of Romans. Not a parenthesis. Okay. Thank you. That's all.